let's start. Va a llegar más gente, ¿no? Si no llega más gente, we'll see.
You're not thinking you were going to share. On that note.
Oh, I just used the social convention.
You know what kind of 2 minutes before 3.
Ok, bueno, muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Vamos a empezar para honrar la puntualidad de todos nuestros colegas. Bueno, hoy nos da mucho gusto tener en el cine a Lena Krook, que es profesora de la Universidad de Rutgers y, como llevo una semana cacareando en Twitter, ¿no? Experta mundial llamada género y política de cuotas de género. Y lo que vamos a hacer es que Mona va a tener más o menos media hora para hablarnos de su trabajo y la paridad de género, ponernos en perspectiva, y después yo y Lena y yo vamos a presentarles la última versión de nuestro esperadísimo paper sobre cuotas, sobre el impacto de las cuotas en México. La presentación va a ser a veces en español, a veces en inglés, y después vamos a tener tiempo para preguntas y respuestas. Mona, bienvenida al cine. It's great to have you.
Yes.
Just for the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for coming today. So I've actually been in Mexico now for 2.5 weeks. I was originally here for some consulting work with USAID and NDI in terms of looking at their women's leadership programming. And so as part of that, I was able to talk to a number of people who've been central to some of the gender quota debates in Mexico. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is to talk about the recent reforms in Mexico and try to situate them in a global perspective. And then, based on some of the research that I've done and some evidence from a recent co-edited book, talk about what those reforms might mean more generally for gender and politics in Mexico. So I just want to start by talking about gender quotas as a new global trend. So this was the subject of my first book, but if I bring the information there up to date, there are now more than 130 countries around the world that have some type of gender quota policy. And almost all of these policies, in fact, have been adopted since 1995. So it's a quite expansive and very recent trend around the world. One of the things that I did in this book was just to talk about different types of gender quotas, which is just helpful background in terms of understanding where the Mexican reforms fit in. So some quotas take the form of reserved seats, which is that they literally set aside for women. So women are guaranteed at least a minimum level of female representation. Then there are party quotas, which are adopted voluntarily by individual parties in terms of their candidates. And then legislative quotas, which are those that are imposed by a reform to the electoral law or to the Constitution. And most policies around the world mandate 30%, whether that's reserved seat, whether that's a legislative quota. Some variation, but that's the general trend. Okay, so if we look actually globally, just to give you a sense of how expansive, how some of the unexpected places we see gender quotas. So Saudi Arabia, where women only got the right to vote at the end of 2011, 20% of the seats in the Shura Council were reserved for women. Which is quite notable because that in fact put Saudi Arabia ahead of the United States in terms of women's parliamentary representation. Yemen also, in February this year, had a national dialogue for their constitution, and out of that dialogue came a recommendation that a 30% quota be established in their new constitution. And just last month, in Egypt, I was part of a mission with the Interparliamentary Union advising the Electoral Commission there on a gender quota that they would introduce in Egypt. There's a new constitution that mandates that women be guaranteed appropriate representation in the national parliament. What is appropriate is another question. But their electoral law reform committee is working on this, and they're going to have a mixed electoral system like you have in Mexico, and they're working with the idea of having reserve seats in the majoritarian component and legislative quotas in the PR component of that law, but that has not yet been approved. So we see it's very extensively discussed around the world, and every month there are new reforms being discussed. Okay, in terms of the impact that these measures have had, it's quite notable. So I like to contrast these two lists. So these are the top 10 countries in the world in terms of women's political representation. The first list is what the top 10 looked like in 1997, which is when the Interparliamentary Union first started to post national rankings in terms of women's parliamentary representation. And we see that it's almost exclusively European countries. And that the top countries are Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, countries you might expect to see at the top of this list. And at that time, the world average was 12%. If we compare this with the newest list, this has changed a lot in less than 20 years. We still see countries like Sweden and Finland, but we also see countries in Africa, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, as well as other parts of Europe. And the change between these two dates has been the widespread introduction of gender quotas. And as a result, we see that the world average has almost doubled during this time. And also the percentages that we're talking about have substantially increased. So in 1997, only Sweden had more than 40% women. And only the top 5 countries had more than 30%. But now we have all of these countries in the top 10 with more than 40% women, and more than 35 countries with more than 30% women. So it's a dramatic change, and that is directly attributable to the introduction of gender quotas. And as part of this transformation, I would argue that we've really seen a shift in perspective on what it takes to achieve gender equality. So traditionally, and I think this is still a view that many people still have, but has shifted at the international level. So it used to be that the idea was you promote development, you promote democracy, and that would spill over into increased representation for women in politics. And we've seen a reversal in a causal direction that is proposed, which is we need to promote equal representation, and then that will help us achieve greater levels of development and greater levels of democracy. So all of these changes have been very important for turning attention to the need to increase women's access to elected positions. Okay, so if I put these developments into context in Mexico, so the new laws that were approved less than 2 weeks ago mandate a few interesting things. So now there's a 50% requirement that all parties have to have 50% female candidates, 50% male candidates. And that's an increase on earlier legislation that mandated a 40-60 balance, and an earlier reform to that, which was 30%, 70%. So it is an increase. We have seen an increase over time in this requirement here. In the PR component, the list component, due to an earlier sentence of the Electoral Tribunal, the requirement is to alternate between men and women. So woman, man, woman, man, woman, man, down the list. So that's already there. In the SMD, majoritarian component, there is language now that says that you need 50% male and female candidates, but female candidates may not be placed exclusively in losing districts, which is quite unique to have that specified in the law. What exclusively means is another question, of course, but it's quite an interesting development. There is also a specification that both the propietario and suplente have to be of the same sex. And this is quite important because, as you probably know, there were some problems in earlier elections where you have a female propietario, a male suplente, and the woman was forced to resign in order to give way for her male suplente, or this was a way to achieve the quota at the election time. And so this has now been designated in the electoral law. Something else is quite interesting, which is not always part of the quota discussion, is that there has been an increase in the funding that is earmarked in political party budgets for training women, for women's leadership programs. And previously that was 2%, it's now 3%. And that is accompanied or supported by a guide on which types of activities that money can be spent on, which is very important because you may know that earlier there were claims made for all sorts of expenses that were not directly related to candidate or to member training, like fumigation services by the crew, for example, hats and t-shirts and things, but that's no longer permitted. So we have quite clearly specified regulations now on both of these aspects. So to put this into context, so I mentioned that 30% is really the norm globally, but what we have seen over the last 2 years is the introduction or the increase of 30% regulations into 50% regulations in a number of countries in Latin America. So Mexico follows countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Panama in this respect. So very much part of a regional trend here. Placement requirements, also very much in line with emerging global trends. So it used to be that many quota laws did not say where women had to be placed. So many parties would put them on the bottom of the list and in losing districts. So this, as we mentioned before, you have to alternate between men and women and the PR component. That's in line with some legal reforms in countries like Tunisia and Senegal. So very much similar to recent reforms there. It's also, I think, a good contrast with what happens in France. So in 2000, there was a change to the electoral law that parties had to nominate 50% women across all of their single-member districts for National Assembly elections. And the result of that reform was that women's representation in the first elections of parity went from 11% to 12%. So almost no change at all. What has happened is that over time, there's been a lot of public backlash to this. And the Socialist Party in particular has made voluntary commitments to place women in more winnable seats. So the result in the last election was that the National Assembly now consists of 28% women. And that's largely due to the Socialist victory in the last election and their commitment to place women in more winnable districts. But that's a voluntary commitment. What we see with the Mexican legislation is that this is also required by law. And then just on the party financing regulations, this is something that is very interesting to me. So we're starting to see more countries that introduce either penalties or incentives to nominate or elect more women, sometimes with quotas, sometimes not with quotas. But there's a smaller number of countries that have started to earmark public funding that parties receive for capacity building of women inside the parties. And so Mexico is an example of this capacity building initiative. And so while it has a lower percentage than some of the other countries which mandate 5% or 10%, it's distinguished by the fact that there are much clearer regulations in Mexico about how that money can be spent. Okay, so the question then becomes, what will be the impact? So the numerical impact, I think, will probably be that we'll see some increase in women's representation. Probably not to 50%, as we've seen in many countries. there's usually a lower number of women elected than the level mandated, but likely to be a slight increase from the present numbers at least. But I think what's more interesting is the question about what happens beyond numbers. And so one of the things that people often say to me once they find out I study gender quotas is this claim that quotas undermine merit in candidate selection, right? That with quotas you get a decrease in the quality of the people who are elected. So this is a question that has started to be empirically assessed in different countries around the world. Actually going to the data to compare the backgrounds of the women and the men who are nominated and elected. And the universal finding is that the women who are promoted through a quota are either as qualified or in fact more qualified than the men who have been nominated. And I think this is a really significant finding. This is Uganda, this is France, this is Morocco. I mean, not only one country, but this is something that scholars are finding across countries. The one area where women do not compare as favorably to men is that they tend to have less political experience, whether that's defined by the number of prior political positions or by the number of years previously in politics. But if we think about that, that's probably not a surprise because women have been denied the opportunity to accumulate that political experience, and that's why we have quotas. So I would anticipate that this finding may be of a more temporary nature, that with more elections we would probably see this pattern erode. There's also some very interesting work on Sweden, which compares the backgrounds of men and women before and after quotas were introduced. And this is at the local level, so this is data with tens of thousands of candidates. And what these researchers find is that after quotas, the quality of the men increases. And their theory about this is that as more seats have to be given to women, this increases competition amongst men, which means that better men, depending if you agree on how they've operationalized this, are elected. Okay, so what this means is that rather than quotas resulting in the election of unqualified women, we're actually seeing the nomination of qualified women, but also an enhancement in the quality of the men. So it's actually a net gain in terms of quality overall. So I mentioned I have been doing some interviews for the last 2.5 weeks in Mexico. So some of it's so universal, it's sad, but these are some of the claims that were mentioned by our interviewees about some of the arguments that have been made in relation to quality. Very commonly, the reaction of political parties is that, well, it would be very difficult to implement quotas because there are not enough women, which is crazy because women are 50% of the population. Millions of people, you can't find 100 women. But it's quite interesting. So in an interview I had yesterday at the Electoral Tribunal, I was told that some women's groups actually published lists of women who are willing to run for office with those political parties. To say, you need women, here they are, right? And this is very similar to what was done in Sweden in the 1970s when women often heard from the parties there are not enough women. So they actually started to collect lists of names so they could present these lists whenever they heard this objection. Another one was this idea that women don't want to run, right? Because of course this is, well, we would love to have women, but then women don't want to. An interview I had at Mujeres, they told me about a study that they did to actually see, did women not want to run? And they found that it was a very small proportion of those women said they're not interested in politics. The biggest proportion of women said They didn't run because they had never been asked. And this is significant because there's a famous study from the United States which found that most women who hold political office in the US ran because someone else asked them to run. And this is important because of women are often socialized not to envision a political career, right? But asking them to run kind of puts the idea in their mind. And in fact, that study of the US found that women had to be asked, on average, 7 times before they agreed to run. So it's not once, not twice, 7 times on average, right? So some women have to be asked more than that. Which suggests that quotas can help women's representation because it requires parties to think about asking women to run. And then lastly, of course, is that even if there are women, the objection is that women are not capable. And I thought this was interesting because almost universally across my interviews, it was pointed out that there are some very active women in political parties whose contributions are overlooked. So clearly there are women who are capable, who are interested, who have skills. But it was also pointed out that this 2% of the party budget could precisely be used for this purpose. If women need skills, you can train them. So I thought this was quite interesting how the evidence also spoke to some of these debates. Okay, a second question has to do with what impact quotas will have on the passage of legislation related to gender equality. And so there are claims that are made in many debates, academic, otherwise, that either we need quotas because women in power will represent women's issues. There are others who argue, of course, that the types of women who win through quotas will not be interested. They'll be the kind of women who aren't interested in promoting women's issues. There's also been a suggestion in research that gender quotas may actually change some of those gender dynamics, either creating a mandate for women to represent women, because if you're elected through a quota, you're chosen because you're a woman. That can create a sense of obligation to represent women. On the other hand, because quotas can be seen as promoting unqualified people or being selected only because you're a woman, could also lead women to say, I need to show that I'm interested in other things but gender issues. So quotas can actually potentially exacerbate those dynamics. So if we look at some of the emerging findings on this, we see that women who are elected through the quota do seem to be having an impact on discourses of politics, as well as in proposals for laws on gender equality issues. However, they're having less impact on policy outcomes. And this is at least due to the fact that even with quotas, women are still a minority of legislators, right? And you usually need 50% or more votes in order to pass this type of legislation. So this would, suggest that men, of course, are very important allies, and they need to be mobilized as well in order to achieve these types of gains. In my interviews, I was quite interested in some of the regulations that had been introduced that we couldn't attribute to women in the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. This I just find very fascinating in a global perspective, which is earmarking of the budgets for the 3 branches of government that require integrating a gender perspective. And I thought this was quite interesting reform. And that came at the same time as this requirement for the party funding of 2%. And this can be directly traced back to, so these were introduced in the 2006-2009 Congress. And one of my interviewees described the women of that Congress as forming sort of informal women's caucus. And so it's very much related to women working together for those types of reforms. I also thought it was very interesting. I had an interview that talked about the significance of women now being a large minority in Mexican national politics, pointing out that for the first time, both houses of Congress have more than 30% women. 38% in the Chamber of Deputies, 34% in the Senate. And it was pointed out that with constitutional reforms, you need a 2/3 majority. So in fact, it was suggested to me that in the Senate, for example, women threatened to block other reforms unless parity was included. And so that, even if you're not a majority, being a large enough minority can also give you a power to act as one. The last impact I want to talk about is the symbolic, or the potential symbolic meaning of these reforms. And this is for democracy, this is for women's empowerment. One of the things I find very interesting about the Mexican case is this continued debate on gender quotas. I mentioned there was a 30% quota, became a 40% quota, became a 50% quota. And I think it's very interesting, you see an increase in this level, but you also see efforts through different mechanisms to try to tackle the resistance of political parties to implementing quotas, and to try to tackle some of the backlash against these measures. And really the only country I have seen such sustained attention to this issue is Sweden. And so I think Mexico compares very, very similarly to Sweden here. The other thing I find very, very fascinating is proposed legislation, which has now been approved in the Senate, to tackle violence against women in politics. This is political violence and harassment against women who are candidates or elected officials because they are women. And I was at a side event of the UN's annual meeting on the Commission on the Status of Women in March, and we did a presentation, my graduate student and I, on this issue of violence against women in politics. And this was a room that was filled with female members of parliament from all countries around the world. And we were talking about this issue. The women just kept nodding and nodding. Everyone understood this as a problem that is experienced by women in all regions of the world. The only country to criminalize this activity is Bolivia. The only other country to have this through the legislative process partially is Mexico. So I think this is also very important, and we can directly trace that to the discussion of gender quotas, because it's about also trying to tackle backlash against women in the political sphere. Another thing that came out of the interviews I did was the normalizing of gender through training activities. And this is because once you open your eyes to the concept of gender, you can't unsee it. Really, you see it everywhere. And this came out very clearly to me in an interview with a man who was the head of the auditing unit at INE. And he specifically can identify a day when he met women from a campaign called 2% or More Women in Politics to talk to him about how parties were spending that 2% of their party budget. And he said, that day changed my life. And he also wrote this in writing, so I know it wasn't just what he told me. Because he said he went from being an accountant and caring about, expenses and balance sheets to realizing sort of the social meaning of that money and the importance that that money was spent on the things that it was supposed to be spent on. And so he talked also about how that really changed attention to gender issues within his unit of INE. And so I think that was very important. And yesterday I had an interview with a magistrate at the Electoral Tribunal, and she talked about how the gender training money had really changed the institutional culture within at least the Electoral Tribunal. And you could really feel it. At the beginning, people were like, oh, but I have to do this, that's for women.